I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wisanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I would also like to acknowledge that our lecture this evening is made possible through the generous support of the Orion Fund that is facilitated through the Office of the Dean of Fine Arts. Our guest today, Curtis Santiago from Edmonton, Alberta, studied as an apprentice of Lawrence Paul Yaxwell-Upton. Santiago has also exhibited internationally at venues such as the Drawing Center in New York, the Flag Art Foundation in New York, the New Museum in New York, the Eli and Edith Broad Museum at Michigan State University in Michigan, the Institute of Contemporary Art at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, the University of Saskatchewan, the Perez Art Museum in Miami, Art Gallery of Ontario, Art Gallery of Alberta, the Rooms in St. John's, Newfoundland, and the SCAD Museum of Art in Savannah, Georgia, among others. The artist was included in the inaugural 2019 Toronto Biennial of Art in Toronto, Canada, the Site Santa Fe Sightlines 2018 Biennial in Casa Tomada in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and was featured in the 2018 Biennale de Dakar in Dakar, Senegal. He is currently an active board member on the board of directors of the Drawing Center in New York and has been invited to be an artist in residence this September 2021 at Black Rock, Senegal. His work is in the permanent collection of the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, New York. Santiago considers himself decentralized and is currently living and working in Munich, Germany. Please join me in welcoming Curtis Santiago.
Thanks so much, Rick. And it's good to see you again. You did a much more thorough job than I would have done. So I'm glad that you did that. And thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to my story, because that's definitely how I feel talking about my practice and my trajectory and my intent with my work is a story and storytelling. It is an unorthodox path, how I've found myself where I am in my artistic, my visual arts career. And so my presentation will be maybe a little unorthodox in its the way we jump around, but I will do my best to kind of keep it linear and keep it going. So where do I begin? I'll begin here with this individual, this gentleman here, and this is Martin Gujerna. But I met Martin Gujerna in 2002 when I had just moved to Vancouver. For most of my life, I have been a musical artist, a musical recording artist from the time I was about 12 until maybe 10 years ago, actually. I was a professional recording artist primarily, and visual arts for a large chunk of that I never thought would play the role it has in my life. But this here was one of the many people on my road who has encouraged and inspired me and told me that I could find a way to make my visual arts my living. And we met through Emily Carr at the Emily Carr School, and how I ended up in Vancouver and at the school is that my now studio manager, but back then Brenda Rains was my music manager, had moved me from Edmonton, Alberta to Vancouver to record with a producer because I felt I was frustrated in the city I was, and this is kind of the start of my troubadour road of moving around the world and feeling that what best suits my practice is to take my work to other locations and experience and be influenced and inspired. So we moved in 2002, I moved to Vancouver to record an album. And in that first year, I remember first month, it rained, I think something like 28 days. And I was feeling really blue and depressed and not knowing how to deal with this kind of seasonal change. And Brenda sent me a set of paints and enrolled me in just an evening drawing, a weekend drawing class with at Emily Carr with Martin Gujerna. And upon the first class with Martin, he came over to me and he asked me, "Do you know who your dad is?" And I laughed and I said, "Of course I know who my dad is." And he goes, "Well, I don't mean to be offensive, but you remind me of my mentor who I met in Paris. And he was an old New York beat poet. And from that point on, he said, there's something about your line. And I don't know if you know what that means, but there's something about your line. And if you ever need to ask questions, come over to my studio and hang out and just draw. And learn how to become a visual artist, my door is open to you. And so this guy was the first one to encourage me. And I could not have achieved any of the things I've achieved because I'm primarily self-taught. I did not, again, we all know what that means. I did not attend, I don't have a BA, and I definitely don't have a master's in art, but I have all of those things in life experience and then some. So Martin was the catalyst. And so here's just some images of his work, and he is still in Vancouver. Now, being out on the West Coast, some of you all may know this gentleman here, Lawrence Paul Yapswilupton. And he is my second mentor. And actually how we met was basically set the path for how the rest of my career would go up until this point. I was, again, learning a new city, didn't have many friends there. I was still new. So I started to go to galleries. And then one afternoon, I went to a gallery and I saw this painting here, Portrait of a Residential Schoolboy. And at this point, I'm still just working my way through my first set of paints, but I was taken by this image, and to the point where I was dreaming about this image, and it just kept coming back to me. So one afternoon in my studio, when you're in your studio and nothing is coming and you're feeling stuck, I decided I was going to take a walk, and I was going to take a trip that I haven't really explored in my neighborhood. And I went walking past Scotia Street. And when I got to this glass condo, I looked in and I was like, man, that guy, whoever lives there, has a lot of Lawrence Pauls. Like, they must be a collector. Again, I'm super green in the visual art world. And then I look in a little further and I see that it's Lawrence and he's there painting. And so I knocked on his studio window, and he came over. And for those who, Lawrence over the last 10, 15 years has really changed. But at this time, he was a real kind of gruff, stern, hard to approach person. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't know a lot of his history about the residential schools and his reason to be really cautious of anybody outside of his communities. And so I knocked on his window and I said, hey, hi, I'm an up and coming artist. I've just started painting. I love your work, thinking, that maybe I could learn with you. And this was me this was an idea I had in my head from reading, you're reading about the Impressionists and all these romantic stories of these painters who would be mentored by a master painter, and they come from this lineage of artists. And so I thought this is just the way he was going to be my sensei. And he kind of looked at me like I was crazy. And then he looked down at my shoes, and the shoes I was wearing were the exact same palette of this painting, right to the purple, the red, the neon green. They were just these crazy, crazy sneakers. And he was like, oh, okay, well, I guess you're not so bad after all. Like, you can come by every now and then. And I would go by every afternoon and knock. And some days I could hear him in there, music playing. He wouldn't answer in the beginning. And then some days he would answer. But then when he saw that I kept coming back, and I was in his studio at the time when this work was being painted. And I just kept coming back. And he said, fine, okay, you're welcome here. So then it became a place that my safe space where I could explore and begin to figure out what type of work I wanted to make. And right around this time, as I'm exploring with materials, here's some more of Lawrence's work. I'm sure, being in the West Coast, many of you are familiar, but if you're not, and I have, yeah. And again, what I was captivated by was that Lawrence had found a way to speak to his heritage. Again, this began very early in my career. I wouldn't understand till later the full impacts of him talking about his ancestry and his sense of spirituality, and not in the Catholic traditional sense, his folklore and myths and tales, and how this could be represented in visual arts. And so here's a piece that at that beginning phase, I didn't have a handle of the brush. I had some lines, but I didn't have a handle of the brush. So I would literally scrape the palettes of Lawrence's, and to look on the other side of because he doesn't mix thoroughly through. Gets the top color going, but then there'd be colors underneath. And I could turn these paint scraps over and begin to see, oh, this color and this color combines, makes this color. It wasn't a traditional mentorship where he has me sitting there and I'm repeating something over and over, or I'm stretching his canvases or washing his brushes. I would go and clean his kitchen up and do things like that because I just want him to be useful and useful to him. And so this time I was taking these materials and I would stack them on canvas, these dried paint scraps, and he called it scrapism. He named it at the time. And so I was making tons of these and I started to put these little miniature figures on the canvas. I think I'd found at a flea market a stack of these little figures. And so I started to embed them in the canvas. And there was this one point, one story, one of the last stories I'll tell about Lawrence before we move on, is that I had done a large scale work, for me, a large scale work. So it must have been like a meter by, I don't know, like half a meter high. And there was all these ornate, little, beautiful details. And I was so delicate. And Lawrence walked up to it and he said, oh, you've been working really hard on this. It's like, yeah. He's like, it must have taken you forever. I'm like, yeah. And then he put his hand on the surface of the canvas and went, and everything fell off. And he said, this is your first lesson. He's like, who are you making work for? What are you making this work for? Are you making it to last? Is it temporary? Is it just fashion? Is it just trend and here today, gone tomorrow? He's like, if you're going to begin to use alternative materials and these different things, you want to make sure that this can withstand. And so that at that time I just started working in little boxes. Again, I was very, when you're an up and coming artist, or if you're self-sustained, my parents were the type of parents who were like, if you really, really needed help, they'd give it to you. But they'd put it in my head a long time ago. You decided to live this alternative path of being a musician. I left school very early. I left school and probably when I was, I think like grade 8 or 9. I had the opportunity to go on the road with a group of musicians who were much older than me, and they were touring across the country. And I was like, well, when am I going to get this opportunity to fulfill this dream? And I was the singer of the group. And so I left. And I remember the first time I left on tour, I came back, my parents almost kicked me out. I have Caribbean parents, so I'm still not too old to get licks, is what we call it. It's like, and that's like a slipper from the foot on the butt. I'm never too old for that with an island mom. And I remember getting in so much trouble, but when the next opportunity came, I went on tour again. And at that point, they just said, if this is what you're going to pursue, you're on your own. We will support you if you desperately need it, but you have to figure this out. And so, yeah, so let's just say the income was very, very low. So I would buy these materials from a man on the side of the streets, and he would sell me like little jewelry boxes and things like this. And so I started to place these miniatures and make these sculptures. And there was this reaction that would happen when I would hand someone a closed box and they would open it up. This was one of my first pieces called Shunga. And I've always been obsessed with Japanese erotic woodblock prints. And so I made an image, and even with its sexual nature and it's pretty explicit, there was this humor involved that I found I could get an emotional reaction, a visceral reaction from people with the dioramas. So I thought, oh, shoot, well, maybe I have something there, because it was feeling good in the studio. At this time in my studio, I'm not thinking about exhibitions. I'm not thinking about museum shows, collectors. I am unaware of this world. And it was like this sweet spot where you're just making just to make, because there's nothing else you want to do with your time. And so these were the early works. This one here is called Banksy is Your Gran. I'm sorry if the images are pixelated here, but we have to compress the file a bit. And so it was like looking at this image of Banksy. And at that time, I was like very into pop culture and pop art, and then the new school. And I had been to London on tour maybe a year or two before and saw a Banksy, the girl with the ice cream cone, the original one with the ice cream cone with the bomb, like it was about to go off. And you have to understand, at that time, for street art, you had just graffiti. And so to see these images of him cleverly placed in these locations, it was, for me, it was like, oh shit, there's alternative ways of, these are almost like cave paintings. There's other alternative ways of taking something that is known, and there's still ways to be original. And so I wanted to pay homage to that experience. And so it's the Queen of England in the middle of the night. And at this time, there's a little light bulb that turns on. And so, yeah, they were cute and they were fun. And then I started to think about the Impressionists and my favorite works and the moment after the paintings that we see, the moment before the painting or the moment after the painting. And Manet being huge for me, the Matador, the dead Matador, was something that I felt I needed to create. So at this time I'm producing, I started producing tons of these things. And a lot of these are the early works, which now the majority of these are in collections and museums, something that I never thought would happen. And when I initially started showing galleries these works, they told me it could never happen and they would laugh. Like, so one thing I always like to talk about artists with is that F what the critics say. You know, like, I know you have crits and feedback, and sometimes feedback can be really positive. Take what serves you, and what doesn't serve you. This is something I wish I would have learned earlier, because when we get to a point in my music career where I shift from visual art, from musical arts to the audio arts and to strictly visual, I'm thankful, but I'm also still kind of like, damn, I wish I would have had this mindset of like, F a critic, you know, like, because my brother one time told me later after this really traumatic experience happened, he goes, thing with reviews and criticism, either you believe it all or you don't, because you're gonna, when people blow you up and gas you up and like, yeah, it's great, you're like, ah, and then when someone you respect it, so that was, but you still like it and you feel that, oh, maybe it is shit. So take it all with a grain of salt is something that I now kind of, well, not even a kind of, I really hold near and dear. This piece here, here's where the work for me started to move into, there's this progression of really fun and playful, sexy, erotic works into this moment where I really start to dive into Goya. And I've always felt these connections to certain artists that feel beyond just I like their work. And if no one ever believes me about how I feel about my connection, it doesn't matter, because I know how it has served me and what it's done for me in the studio and my practice. So I became obsessed with the Disaster at War etchings by Goya, and I studied them religiously. And I started to find these moments on the internet where it's almost like we're retelling these Goya works through YouTube, through our cell phones, through the media. So this one here, Tell Them to Stop, Tell Them Stop, is taken from a YouTube video where a man is in Palestine looking for his family in a bombed out building, and he gets shot by a sniper. And you hear people on the sides letting, tell him to stop, tell him to stop. And then when you look through the Disasters of War etchings, you find compositions that eerily mirror what we're seeing here. I'm just going to move through the dioramas here. I'm looking at I wanted to, again, like I said, it's not going to be linear. I'm going to be moving around, and then hopefully there's time for questions and I can touch on some things. For me, this picture here is a crowning achievement it's just a crowning achievement. I think it's okay to celebrate our wins. This was my installation at, let me see if I can't move that. Okay, there we go. Yeah, this was my installation at the Site Santa Fe Biennial. And what it was a culmination of 75 works, bringing back some of my earliest dioramas to the ones that I were making specifically for this installation. And you don't know what you sometimes the road kind of seems, for me, it was the path was so unclear, because again, like I was told when I initially decided, okay, well, Lawrence says I have to go get a gallery, or I have to start the show, or try to meet people. I would take my little portfolio, I would email the portfolio, I would even walk into galleries with a box of dioramas and want to talk, and they were having none of it. And I was told, oh, these are cute, these are kitschy, no, this isn't contemporary art, blah, 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 blah. But I just kept making them because I loved them. And then to be able to bring them all together, to see what a full story, what years of work when brought together, the story it can tell. And so when I did this piece here, it ranged from my really, funny and mundane moments, of quiet moments of life, to the erotic, to the real heavy works that I began to do for a period of time that I had to stop at the advice of Martin Gudjorna, who, because Martin, and again, I'm bouncing, but Martin, my first mentor, he worked a lot with war. He worked a lot around the idea of trauma and suffering. And years later, that feeding yourself just that information over and over is a heavy, heavy, heavy burden. And later, I would remember going to see Martin in the studio, and he'd be walking around and just be like, "Oh, fucking war," literally like just muttering to himself about this heavy, heavy, heavy stuff. And so he always kind of said, "Curtis, you know, like you need to enjoy life as well." So seeing this exhibition, I'm kind of lost myself there, but being able to present all these works and to seeing that all these different stories play into the narrative of who I am as an artist. I stopped viewing, like I can have a body of work, like for this exhibition, this body of work, but I'm more interested in now in how this moment, these 5 months of life that I've spent making this, fit into the larger frame of me as an artist, from even my first song recorded to however long I live to make work. And so seeing this was, for me, was a joy to see it, these works that weren't deemed contemporary art, elevated on this level. And the best part of it was just to the right of this image here, they had some of Lawrence's heavy work. So I ended up being curated into a biennial with my mentor, my sensei, and that was a very proud moment. Here's the Toronto Biennial again, a different presentation of these works, an iteration of this. And so we will get to the jump off, as I like to think of it. And so it's around 2016. And again, in my career, I'm still like, wow, what am I doing? Like, again, schools don't often teach you about the business end of fine art or the networking aspect of fine art, which I think in the beginning, when you first get to school, like, yeah, you shouldn't even be really worried about like, what am I making? You should just be making. Like, you have this time, you have time in this safe space, your studio. No one's really coming in there unless you're inviting them. And so, yeah, so the jump off. So there's nothing really happening in my career because I have high aspirations. I want to show here now that I've had a little taste of my first exhibition in Vancouver, and Lawrence has told me that I must go to Paris. So I go to Paris and I see the Manets and the works that I've always wanted to. Now I'm getting an understanding of what the art world could be, and ambition. And so I, believing what I believe, took a pilgrimage to Montreal to see this painting by Basquiat, because it was the only painting that I knew of in Canada of Basquiat. And here we have, in this painting, use a boxing, you see this boxing image here, and this is Susan Malouk fighting Madonna, and this had happened at the Mud Club. And so I'm standing in front of this painting, because Basquiat was, my eldest brother, Anthony, he's an incredible artist in general. He sang opera, he danced ballet, he can paint, he can draw. He would introduce me to 3 artists. He introduced me to Rembrandt, Basquiat, and Manet. And through that, he would draw connections to Tiepolo and Twombly and a host of, the ones that we know very well from art history. And we'll get to the lesser known names later, which I think are super, super important. And but anyways, he told me about Basquiat. And when I first saw that work, when you see something or you see whoever it is, whatever style of art you prefer, when you see that thing that resonates with you and the hairs on your neck stands up. Because for me, again, it has to be a visceral experience. I want to cry in front of a piece. I want to cry from a poem. I want to laugh loudly. I want to want to make love because this work is so, I want to feel something. And so this painting, I stood in front of it and I was like, yo, I need a sign that this is the right thing. Like, I need some help. I'm living in Toronto on a couch in a friend's basement, and I'm like, I can't stay here much longer. Music for me has just come to this crashing halt. I had spent years working on this album with this producer, and at the same time, this producer is working with another artist, and the two of us I'm working mornings, this artist was working the evenings, and our albums are with the same producer, so the sounds are becoming similar. And then our albums come out, and Pitchfork reviews both of our albums. And while I had received like good reviews from other albums, Pitchfork at that time was like the dandada, it can make or break you. And they said I was the gravel voice version of this artist trying to copy their sound. And this artist has gone on to become The Weeknd. So at this moment, I'm like, I've spent years developing this sound in Toronto. Toronto for me in that moment will always feel, those years will always feel like we Canada had a Motown. Because in the studio, you had Daniel Caesar, you had Charlotte Day Wilson, you had Abel, you had myself, you had Chaos, you had all these all these different people gravitating around this space. And we know what has happened to The Weeknd. We know. So after how many years, 20 years of working on music, thinking that this was going to be the pop moment for me. And then all of a sudden to get this bad review, and all of a sudden my booking agent stops calling. All the tours just stop. It all just, and at that time I was working on music during the day, and I would come home and I would try to paint and draw at night. And so I was running myself ragged. So I'm broke again, I'm running myself ragged, and I just need something. And so my friend says, let's go to Montreal. And I end up in front of this painting, and I'm like, yo, Basquiat, I love you so much. I love your work. Can you give me, I just need a boost. I just need something. And as crazy as it sounds, which isn't so crazy, we'll get to that. I get a phone call from the Art Gallery of Ontario, and they're having an announcement. And they're like, well, we heard that, you do performance art. I've never done performance art. For me, the only thing I'd ever done a performance was a musical performance, being on a stage with a band. And so they're like, we heard you do performance art. And I'm like, yeah, I do. And they're like, would you create a piece for us to then announce an exhibition? And they're like, if you can keep this to yourself, the exhibition is, we're going to be having the largest Basquiat exhibition in North America. To come to North America. And my mind was just like, okay, yeah, I got this. And immediately what came to mind was my first time in Trinidad. This is the artwork of Peter Minshall. And when I was in Trinidad around 8 years old, he presented this costume. And immediately at that point, I was like, whoa, this guy is kind of feels like Basquiat. He's influenced by Basquiat, but Basquiat's influenced by the Caribbean and voodoo and the occult. And I, again, very early, I didn't know the connections. I'm just feeling there's synergy between these things. And I say, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create, we don't have a photo of the Basquiat work, but Basquiat has one of his last paintings is titled Riding Death. And I said, I'm going to take that last painting, I'm going to turn it into a carnival costume. I'm going to get 12 dancers from all different styles of dance, and we're going to play Haitian voodoo music and music from the Caribbean that talk about death and rebirth. And we're going to move and have carnival through the museum. And they're like, oh, this is great. Well, what we could do is we could have your costume, your thing, your performance lead right up to where Matthew at the time, that was the director at the HO, is going to pull the curtain. We're going to have this, and we're going to announce it. So when this night happens and they pull the curtain, and the painting that they decide to use to announce the Basquiat exhibition is this piece here, a panel of experts, my hairs and everything went up. And I was like, okay, whatever I did, it's happening. And now is the time, there's this moment. And it went on to be that I became the ambassador of this Basquiat exhibition because I was so in love with this work that I knew a lot about it. And so this is Luc, and this is Jean-Michel. And so, when they have at a museum, when they have a big blockbuster show, they're going to have this dinner, a dinner of about 100 people. And so at this dinner, I sit down and I'm sat next to and the place cards. And I'm like, holy shit. On my left, it's Michael Holman, who was Basquiat's bandmate in Gray and dear friend. And on my right is Susan Maluk. And I'm like, what? Susan Maluk from the panel of experts painting? Okay. And so these two New York, these are like, remember, these were like New York cool kids in the 80s when Herring and graffiti is popping and Blondie. So those kind of energy, those people remain until they're dead and gone. They're always going to be these cool cats. So they sit down and she's in electric blue with a fur and she has a dog on her lap. And I'm this kid who's known her face and known her, here's Michael and Susan, for most of my artistic journey in life. I've always known who these faces were. And at that moment, the former governor general of Canada starts talking about Basquiat. And she was like, he was a Black artist and a Black man in the time made Black art. And I could feel Susan start to sink, Michael start to sink. And they're like, oh, man. I'm like, oh shit. I pulled this piece out of my pocket. It's called Sad Boy. And it was originally a portrait of me and just referencing this moment when my music came crashing down. I felt all this opportunity was happening and I was super bummed out. And I'm sitting on this crystal ball, like asking the fortune teller, like, yo, what happened to my fortune? And I hand it to her, to Susan, and she looks at it and she tears up and she says, this is exactly how Jean-Michel felt. And she passes it to Michael and she goes, man, like, yo, like, who are you? Blah, 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 blah. She goes, can I have it? And now at this time, I'm like, what do you mean, can you have it? Like, this is my currency. If I sell one of these, at the time I would have got it for like $800, $1,000 for it. I'm like, this would be pay my rent and buy some food and get some supplies and I'd be good for a little bit. And my instincts, my intuition as always says, yeah, sure. And so what she does is she writes her name on this card and her phone number and says, when you come to New York, next time you're in New York, hit me up. So with opportunity, because I'm a person who jumps on opportunity, took my ass to New York. And it was around Easter time of, it was like later in 2016, yeah. And I'm roaming around Chelsea, because that's where the galleries are. And I come across this work here and the sculptural form of it. And this is by Bruce Gagne, who is a Canadian artist who's been in New York for quite some time. And at this moment, my brain goes, if I'm ever going to take it to where I need to take it, I need to study. I need to understand figure in a way that I can manipulate it like this. And like I told you, like I mentioned that I went to Paris earlier when Lawrence suggested I go. And in Paris, I saw the work of Marcus Lupertz and the way he was manipulating figure. I was like, yeah, I had the first light bulb to study goes off. And so I'm like, oh, I have to study, I have to study, I have to study. So I'm in New York now I'm going to be there for about a week and a half. And my whole goal is to have dinner with Susan and just to be around that energy and those people and to talk about art in the 80s and learn more about my favorite artist. And while I'm there, I'm like, well, what am I going to do? So I hop on Tinder and I'm like, I'm going to go on a date. And I match with this woman and we decide to meet in Greenpoint, and I head to Greenpoint one afternoon. And as soon as we meet up, the vibe isn't on. And she's like, I'm a little too eccentric. I'm like, she appears a little too conservative and the vibe isn't there. And we're just like, oh, well, it's nice to meet you, but I don't think it's gonna. And we're like, yeah. And as I'm saying that, this man comes to put out his garbage and he drops his garbage on the curb. And as I look behind him, there's this purple plexiglass with these dark shadows. And I was like, hey, what are those shadows? He's like, oh, they're my sculptures. And I'm like, oh, I'm an artist too. And of course I got boxes on me, and he's like looking, he's like, wow, blah, blah, come on in. And when I walk into the studio, lo and behold, it's Mr. Bruce Gagne's studio. And so I immediately seeing this opportunity, and my experience being from meeting Martin to meeting Lawrence, being like, hey man, like I need to study figure and understand figure. Is there any way that I could study with you and be like an apprentice? I can help out of the studio. I have experience with that. And he says, no. He goes, I don't do that. I teach at this school though, New York Studio School. If you show up tomorrow, I will introduce you to the dean, Graham Nixon. And I was like, yeah, okay, no problem. And so this is Saturday. I show up at the studio, at the school. He introduces me to Graham. I show Graham my work, my little dioramas. And again, in Canada, I was getting no's about these dioramas. But here I'm in New York and I'm getting yes. And the dean sees this. And he goes, well, what's your academic background like? And I'm like, well, to be honest, I left school very early to pursue music. I don't have a degree. I just have life experience and I spent a lot of hours making. He goes, okay, well, we'll make it work. And that's how I got my visa for the United States. So that January of 2017, I arrive in New York. And so New York is all about the hustle. Let's see what we got here. Okay, we'll get to these words. Yeah. New York is all about the hustle, and I'm living in the United States now for the first time, and I get this opportunity. And while I'm there, I start thinking about Goya again, and I'm just looking through the internet, and I find this image here. And of course, while I'm in the States as a Black man living there for the first time, I'm followed by police, I'm harassed by police, like a very real ass thing. And I started looking into the imagery of this again, and I saw this image of Michael Brown, and what immediately came to mind was Goya, and the 3rd of May. And so I thought, well, maybe I can tell Michael Brown's story in my language. And so this is the execution of Michael Brown. And this was one of the first pieces I made while in States and while in school, because in school I would be able to do my regular classes and had a little studio to make my thing. And at that time, a curator and a group of people came into the school studios, and someone saw the work and they said, well, hey, and this is now January, again, it's the first month in. And they said, well, next month, there's Spring Break Art Fair. I know the people who run it. Let me make a call and see if we can get you a little room. Do you have a curator who can curate it? And I said, yeah. And I didn't really have one in mind, again, seizing opportunity. But my homegirl, Magdalena Nasamakis, who I met through the Basquiat exhibition, who was working at the AGO, who was one of the first people to give me a show in Toronto. And that show in Toronto was, we rented out a convenience store, an old abandoned convenience store, and we made this window of the storefront look like it was like a Tiffany's, and it was in an underserved, lower income neighborhood, and like right at this intersection where you would have many cultures and immigrants passing. And I made works that would speak to my parents' immigrant community and to the Black community, and we put them in this display. And so I was like, yo, I think Magdalene could do this. And Magdalene said yes. She came to New York and we displayed these works. Wait, what is going on? Oh, there we go. I'm sorry, just more of, yeah. Displayed this work in particular, because right around the, shortly after Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and I Can't Breathe, the movement happened. Another man murdered again. And so these works were a hit at spring break. The first thing I sold was to the director of the Brooklyn Museum, Ann Pasternak. And again, I didn't know who these people were, but within 2 months' time, the New York dream happened. And my work became recognized in New York City, and I started to gain opportunities. And this work was the piece that ended up in the collection of the Studio Museum in Harlem and was exhibited there. And if you don't know the Studio Museum, it's known for supporting artists like Kehinde Wiley and Kerry James Marshall, and a lot of African-American artists who weren't getting opportunities because the market and the institutions weren't interested in the story of women and people of color. And so this moment kind of kicked it off, because within the art world, it's like, oh, I don't have a gallery, but somehow I've sold work to a museum. People started talking, and again, no formal way in, no traditional way in. I found this was an opportunity that happened. I'm looking at the time and I'm like, So at this time, I'm making works. I'm really digging into Gudierno territory, and I'm looking at atrocities. I'm looking at works from the past that are really telling the same thing. So the Wrath of Medusa, and even Turner's the slave ship that sank, which I think is not Song. No, he didn't paint Song. But I'm starting to research what's happening globally, and finding that a way for me to deal with the anger and frustration I was feeling of being like, how come people continuously be so cruel? I'm making these works and thinking to myself that I'm doing good work. Well, when that shifted and this is coming to the end of my first semester, when I started to sell these works and then visit the collectors' homes, the people purchasing these works, and seeing and starting to understand the idea of the neoliberal mind, and this like, oh, this is supposed to heal you of some guilt. Meanwhile, I'm making money now off of images of people suffering and trauma. And something clicked where I was like, nah, I can't at this time make these works anymore. And so I took a pause from from my dioramas. And as I left school, I took a pause, and what had happened through the spring break art fair is that I was recognized by Pioneer Works. If you haven't heard of Pioneer Works residency, it's in Red Hook, Brooklyn. It is a phenomenal institution, the best residency I've ever done. And later in questions, I can tell you why, but like my studio was next door to Jana Levin, who at that time was, she's a theoretical physicist who was up for a Nobel Prize for her book, Black Hole Blues. But then we had residents in an artist, somebody who was interested in agriculture, growing fruits, and like it was just so across the board with multidisciplinary creative minds that it just created so much beautiful momentum. One of them being is that I had access to this place called Material of the Arts. At Material of the Arts, you can go in and it's a warehouse of just art supplies and things that, from faux finishes to like they've torn down an old church and they have some of the wood and whatever was donated, you could go and take as an artist. And when I got there, I found a mountain of Arches paper. And so I took nearly $2,000, close to $3,000 worth of Arches paper. And that summer in the Pioneer Works residency, which when it started was supposed to be a 1 month, 2 month residency max. At the end of it, I spent 7 months. And the reason why I got to stay 7 months is because I never left. I would sleep on my studio floor and wake up and keep drawing and working. And this was the beginning. And I started to think, okay, well, what am I going to work about? I can't work about, I don't want to show Black bodies and suffering. I don't want to talk about trauma. What about my ancestors? What about joy? What about, and at this time I'm working on paper and I have this this particular red spray paint, and I went, and when I hit that red, I was transported back to the first time in Trinidad during Carnival. So that Peter Minshall costume I showed you before was right around Juve, which is a celebration right before you give everything up for Lent. People go off and you dance until you start early in the morning and you dance all day. And it was the first time that I met my relatives. And because growing up in Canada, all my relatives were in Trinidad or New York. And so I had never really met my Caribbean side of the family. And so I was like, okay, ancestry. This red reminds me of Juve. Maybe I can use this color as a vehicle to continuously talk about ancestry. Who am I? Like, how far back can I go? So then immediately I think about the slave days and what that must have been like. And I'm like, well, that's still based in trauma, but they must have had some joy. So I put on Odetta, this Odetta song, which I wish the title here was, but it's not. I can't remember the title. And I just started intuitively drawing to the song. And this work was one of the pieces that happened during this residency, along with these works. So I'm thinking of, I got medieval ancestors. So you see the red face. This is one of the early red face drawings. Then I'm like, well, I bet you then if I'm going to play with history, let me create these weird sort of religious style figures and play with like the Byzantine movement. And I'm just jumping around thinking of ancestry as this. We all go back as far as time, so let's just play. And through this play, I'm not even really recognizing, but I'm dealing with the fact that one night coming home from the night that the day Philando Castile was killed by the police, and he was live on Facebook, murdered by the police live on Facebook. Maybe 2 days later, I'm riding my bike home from the studio at like 3, 4 in the morning, because it's like, I got to get a fresh set of clothes, and a police car follows me, and they get behind me. And I'm riding up this Myrtle Ave hill in New York, in Brooklyn, and the cop car is right behind me. And they're following me up this damn hill. And then I get to the top of the hill and they pull beside me and they just kind of look at me. And I'm like, oh my God, they take my life. Do they know I'm Canadian? Like, this is the crazy shit you start thinking, but well, I'm covered in paint. I don't look like, I'm like, well, what do these Black men look like that got killed? They were just men. But you start to try to, they can't be me. And fear and anxiety. And I was just like a wreck. And so in the studio, it started to think about the life that came before, and they were resilient and somehow they found a way to survive. And I started thinking about joy and these things. And so I started thinking of ancestors. why is my, there we go. And this was the first red face, the Juve red face. And she's got Bantu knots on. And I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, this felt good. And I'm starting to get back to that charcoal drawings that I used to do with Martin. And at this time, during this residency, here's one of my first nights. Another ancestor drawing, simple line work. I have a studio visit with the Rachel Luffner Gallery. And one thing I want to share is that I've learned is that I don't take studio visits. I don't try to imagine what anybody's thinking when they're in my studio anymore. It can be really hard, of course, but I don't. I'm like, you have no idea. They could smile and say they love it and think it's shit. It could be vice versa. So Rachel came for her studio visit, and it was the last visit of 8 other artists. She had to pick up her son in half an hour. And so we were just like, I'm like, this is going terribly. Like, this is going terribly. And she didn't really say anything. She's like, wow, you have a lot of drawings. I'm like, yeah. She's like, you work a lot? I'm like, yeah. No vibe, nothing. And then she leaves. And I was like, oh, that was a waste of time. Blah, 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 blah. Then a month later, I get a message being like, hey, it's really short notice. I know you're prepared and you have a lot of work. Would you be interested in taking this November slot? And at this point, I hadn't had a gallery show in New York. And of course, opportunities there. I say yes. And in that show, I show, come on, iPad. I show Lowland Live. No, it's the song is sang live, and it's called Lowlands. And I showed this one as one of the drawings. And at that show, Claire Gilman, who is the senior curator of the Drawing Center, saw this work, and it spoke to her. The way she described it spoke to her the way that Lauren's drawing spoke to me. She's like, Curtis, I see so much art. I don't really buy art. I have 2 kids to put through school in New York, which is quite pricey. But I kept thinking about this drawing, and I bought the drawing. And so she bought the drawing. And later, a relationship would develop, and it was just as simple as sending her things sometimes, not bombarding her with stuff. And lo and behold, it ends up with leads to me having an exhibition last year at the Drawing Center, which for me still is, outside of becoming a father recently, is one of the highlights of my life, because I've always loved the Drawing Center. And another institution, if you're not familiar with, please check out online. And if you have an opportunity when we're able to move around a bit more, you're in New York, you have to check out the Drawing Center. So this culminates the end of my New York chapter. So this happens, this residency ends as Donald Trump is being inaugurated. And I'm like, I'm out of here. I'm heading to, I don't know where I'm gonna go. Then I have a studio visit and I get offered a residency in South Africa. And so in South Africa, my whole mindset was like, okay, well, I'm now in Africa, the motherland. I'm closer to my ancestors than I've ever been. Let's continue this. I recognize that I'm running out of time. I've got 10 minutes to wrap this up. Okay, well, I get to South Africa, and maybe I can wrap it up by talking about intuition when creating. On my airport ride from the airport to the residency, I was going to, you know, as you stare out the window in a new space and you're in a new city and you're like, what's happening here? I came across these men beating. I would notice men beating on the side of the road, like little glass beads, beating tourist objects. And I was like, that's the medium I need to work in. Even this idea of a group of people sitting, making together, this is something I need to be involved in. And I said, I need to make a suit of armor. And it was inspired because on the plane, I was looking at medieval imagery, looking for the image of Africans in medieval artwork. And I found, I'm gonna skip ahead. Let's skip. Sorry. So many works. This image here, unknown artist, and it's based, it's a picture from a painting from Lisbon. And here we have this African who is from the Order of Santiago, which when I found out, of course, my little, oh, this is amazing. And you don't often see Black knights. And so that was the catalyst where I'm like, okay, I'm going to look into Black Knights. My thing's not letting me scroll quickly, so I'm just gonna, yeah. And so this started the research for the beaded armor, which is the Juve Knight, which plays on Carnival. And as a Carnival character I developed, he became this mythical time traveler that starts here in the medieval period when we first catch up with him. Here was my references. And I've always found a lot of connection coming back to Spain and Portugal. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to take myself after my time in South Africa, not wanting to come back to Canada where things weren't popping for me, and not wanting to go back to the United States where Donald Trump was president. I was like, let's go to Lisbon and begin to research Moorish history, these images of Black folks during the medieval period. And I started making objects around that. And I was like, well, dioramas can't be I can't feel trapped by my only sculptural practice is making these dioramas. So I make my first chainmail do-rag with the assistance of Maddie Hayes, an incredible artist in New York. And this was the first chainmail piece called Protect Your Neck. And I was making do-rags out of chainmail because I was like, okay, well, my knight, Sir Dingole, this Juve knight, he's going to have collected objects along his travels. He's going to have adornment and things of protection. And so here was my chainmail do-rag that he wore. Here is this piece is called Warahun, but it's as if on his journey. So a long time ago, National Geographic's online posted an apology, and the apology. Now, when I try to find this apology, it's like I dreamt it up, but it's later been acknowledged by other archaeologists that they were hacking off back in the day, hacking the noses off of figures that looked too African, because they wanted to connect Egypt and these spaces back to just different races of people, and not have it be that it was the Kush or the Nubas and Black African folks. So I was like, well, along the way he finds these noses. He goes around reclaiming the noses hacked off of these sculptures. So this isn't cast acrylic as it says, it's actually glass. I would create my own artifacts like this one here, the red-faced ancestor rock. And I'm beginning to build this world, not knowing that the drawing center is coming where I really begin to be able to see this world materialize. But now I'm in Portugal and I'm able to research Moorish history, and I'm making these works here. This piece here, I'll just add, was my first piece painting that I later sold to a museum. And it was just an anecdote is that, so this was the study I made while traveling. And I thought that I was going to transpose this into a painting. And this was pastel and it was about this big. And for me, it was a learning lesson that because something worked for me and I liked the effect, just copying it at that scale for learning about painting, that wasn't painting. I was just transcribing something, that's transcription. And so that I was talking to the painter Ambera Wellman. If you're not familiar with her work, I would urge you to take a look, because she is a wizard witch with the brush. She pushed me to just paint, to like lose the image, not hold on to this. This is what it has to be, because painting is still something that I feel fairly new to me. And when I get exhibitions requesting paintings, I'm still a little bit in shock. And it's like, that's something I just kind of have to like own up to and be like, hey, there's many ways into the canvas. And because I grew up looking at different styles, I always hold these styles in a certain level, at a certain light. And I'm learning to really embrace what I do as what I do. Yes, these are my Portuguese works. I feel like I've been talking a lot. I would rather in the time like take questions. I've really dove into joy. My work these days are a lot about joy. And and thinking about, for example, Carnival in Trinidad, I started thinking about what would the first few carnivals after slavery ends be like, when people could really express themselves. Of course, they still have nothing, but they have freedom. And how that would feel. So I started looking at old carnival characters like Dame Lorraine and the robber and the fancy sailor. And I've started to make these works. And these works, again, were originally for another project, but that's not even worth talking about. It'd just be like name dropping, and that's kind of stupid. Let's quickly go to installations. So in 2019, I got to I was able to build my first public work, and I decided to make an ancient disco ruin. Like, I've been really into Capriccio. While I was traveling, I was able to see a Canaletto exhibition and started to then research Capriccio. And I love the idea of pointing out how society is decaying by constantly bringing back these romantic images of ruins and columns, and meanwhile pointing out how our own environment, contemporary environment, is kind of falling apart. So in an area where a lot of the detritus from the buildings in Toronto that are torn down, and they're trying to prevent Toronto from flooding, so they're man-made, stop this river, and now the water rises in a certain area, so then they throw all this debris in another area. I started scavenging some of the debris along with some whole stone, and with a team of masons, I created the Juve Temple. And this temple was going to act as a time portal for my beaded knight to then be able to travel through time. And there's a video that I made that is up on my website if you ever want to see of how the knight travels. And yeah, so this is the Juve Temple here. And this was so fun to make. And it was my first large scale, essentially scaling up the things I was doing in dioramas, which was perfect training and a precursor. Oh, I love this chunk of wall. Like this brick here is some of the oldest brick in Toronto. It was from an old factory in Pennsylvania. Some of the original buildings in Toronto were built with these bricks, and you can find them. And I just love that this stone obviously has a history long before us. And yeah, is there an evening shot? Oh, maybe here we go. Here's the disco and the knight. In the video, you'll see him teleporting. I'm going quickly though. The red face ancestor. So Juve, as I mentioned, when I was in Trinidad, my grandma colored my face in red clay. And coming from Sherwood Park, Alberta, Canada was quite conservative. My little suburb was quite conservative. So I was like, oh, are we going to go out with this red paint? And all my relatives had it. And you start as the sun is coming up. And I just remember the sun hitting everyone's faces. And in my mind, it was like everything went animated and illuminated. And I felt for the first time I'm with my people, because growing up in Sherwood Park, Alberta, where I grew up, there wasn't many faces that looked like mine. And so you get used to it. So when you experience the alternative of being surrounded by faces that do look like yours, the joy for me, was unparalleled. And it became a mark of like, this is important. And it is important to come back to my source, to my roots, to not feel the gaze that has been pushed on you from society as what it feels like to be a Black man, or, So, and here's videos from the Sir Dingley, which again is on my website. And so I will lead us to the Drawing Center exhibition, and then maybe we can just take it from there. And this will be the last installation. So Kentai Altar, which happened in 2020, was my first museum solo show in the United States. And what I decided to do was to build the world of Sir Dingley. And the idea is that he's come home. It's like you've come, for me, these memories of coming home from a rave at like 8 in the morning, 9 in the morning, you're still tripping, and you kind of fall on your bed, and all the memories of what happened, and like an acid flashback. And so you step into Sir Dingley's world, and being the drawing center, there was always this question of where they don't normally have installations. Well, where are the drawings? Where are the drawings? And I was trying to tell them, well, the walls, everything, this is all drawing, from the scaffolding acting as my grid, holding this Capriccio up as in the grid that you would have to traditionally draw. But all of this here is all paper. So I had made rubber molds of some of the oldest walls, little sections of wall during my travel. And then we would later make a glorified paper mache, and with the scaffolding and the structure, you enter Sir Dingolay's world. So it was a world that you would walk through. Like, I think you can see I'm unable to see myself, so I don't know how much of my hand gesture is picking up, but I'll just run you through. So these works here, which I have solos of, are sections, like a tapestry of sections of different walls from different places I've been. And then we cast them and make this paper compound, this composite that would absorb pigment really well. I could spray paint and erase and sand, and it's like heavy. Like, these works are heavy. And I wanted the scaffolding to be bent like the archways in some of the ruins that I was visiting. Because for the research of this exhibition, I spent time in Brescia, Italy, where they found Roman ruins. I went to Greece. I went to areas of ruins, saw cave paintings in South Africa, and just was looking at and getting a feel for this time clash that I wanted to create. This green is specific in New York. Anytime you have construction, you have to have things barricaded with this hunter green. So I wanted that to be a heavy element of the exhibition, reminding you that even though we've transported to another world, not knowing where it is, we're still in New York. And the beauty of the construction site, I always find that some of the best works happen on the rusted steel. The best images happen, in this clash of rubbing and weathering and time and erosion and lack of aesthetic, but creating. Yeah. And due to COVID, this exhibition was only open up for a month, and that taught me a lot. 2 years of preparation. I'm thankful we had the month to show, but it also taught me a lesson about, like, I thought that this was going to be, I was going to get the New York Times review. I was going to get blah, 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 because the Drawing Center is a big institution in New York and often well attended. But we were closed for the majority of the run, the 4 months, even extended after that. We just couldn't open. And that in itself, it was a humbling and a beautiful reminder of that the practice goes on, and that this is a stone in this wall that I'm building that I call a career, and it's just a moment. And while in this moment, it was the most important moment, I worked so hard for it. There'll be more to come, and I'm at peace with that. So here are the large works, and again, they're this capriccio, this mashup of, is it a battle scene referencing James Ensor, but it's called Road March, and it's representing Carnival, when people would come together and you're dancing in the streets, and it's different costumes from different eras. Yeah. My manifestation piece, I made this work in Portugal. Again, I believe in the power of intent and dreaming and working from a place of intuition. And so this piece, I had canvas. The canvas was originally a fabric print of all the birds and the birds and the toucans. And I started to cut away from the image. And when I was done cutting away, I had an image that reminded me of Rembrandt's Jewish Bride, where he has his hand on his partner's breast. They've just been married, and now he can officially touch her. And I remember when I saw this painting, first of all, it's Rembrandt, and it's done so well, so well, that I was overcome with emotion, that I cried in front of this work. And it was the first masterpiece that I ever really cried in front of. And then reading Letters to Theo from Van Gogh, and Van Gogh talking to his brother, telling him when he saw this painting, it brought about the same energy. And so in this image, the knight Sir Dingolay has his hand on the stomach of his pregnant partner. And at this time, my partner and I, we didn't have a child. And when I started this piece, I hadn't met my partner yet. And now, as of today, we have a beautiful little 5-month-old child. And this painting will hang in our home as a totem. But I think I'm just gonna wrap it up there, and maybe we can take questions. Rick, do you wanna jump in and talk to me? Let me know what your thoughts are.
I think it's great. So far, I have so many questions. I'd
Well,
love to hear
maybe
more.
let's.
Pardon?
What's that? Sorry. Go ahead.
I mean, the work is amazing, and you're such a great storyteller too. I could listen all day. But just to be cognizant of Kelly's time too, and what's
Yeah.
coming next with the class. One of the questions I have is, a lot of some of the grads here are graduating this year, and they're kind of thinking, what comes next. I know a lot of them are
Mm.
thinking that. And one of the things that really struck me about your presentation is um, this this aspect of chance, of being at the right place at the right time, being out in the world, like making yourself available to those opportunities that arise that you then jump on, and how important that is just to kind of take that risk and go out into the world and really try to connect and engage with people in a really human way, not just like showing up with your work
Yeah.
and
Yeah. And
the gallery.
yeah.
That never works. But just to kind of be present and engage with other people and being in the world. I'd love to hear more about that, and I think they would.
That comes from the way that my mother raised me. The one she always said, she goes, "You're a manifester. You can bring things that you dream." Because I remember I want to blah 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 blah, and I would have this dream, and I would tell her, and then somehow, some way, some elements of that would begin to appear in my life. So she always said, like, be aware of what you're asking for, and be prepared. So these opportunities to jump on wouldn't have gone anywhere if I hadn't been doing the work. So when I met Bruce Gagne, I'd already had dioramas in my pocket. I'd already had countless hours of just making, that I felt confidence in myself to be like, hey, whether they like it or not, I know I've put in the time. I'm going to just say, hey, take the risk. Because the worst, my mom, another thing she'd always say, the worst that someone can say is no. She's like, you can ask me. The worst I can say is no. I won't berate you and think your idea is stupid. Or so the worst I can say is no. I said no. And it's nothing personal. Who knows when someone says no, what their reasons are. Yeah, exactly. It's no if you don't ask. And that was with Lawrence. He could have said no. And thankfully he didn't. And I found more often than not, when it's met with passion and sincerity, the request isn't often denied. It's when, it's kind of like, I want to get in with him so then I can meet his friend. Like, if I would have been like, I want to meet Lawrence so he can introduce me to a gallery, that shit would have gone nowhere. It was like, I I don't even know what he's doing with galleries. I do, and through being there, I got to listen to phone calls and see how he handled himself and was strong. And like, so that is again, learning that lesson very early. It has set the tone where I'm just like, what's the worst thinking? I've been told no before in music. Oh my God, countless no's from record labels, countless no's, countless no's. And that's something, when that critic said, no, this ain't it. And I listened in that moment. One hand, my visual arts career, when I fully focused in, then it began to pop. But I allowed someone's no to really affect me profoundly, where I never wrote another song again. And as stories on stories, my ex-girlfriend years later, she's in London sitting at a dinner table she's a musician with a bunch of music people, and this critic is sitting across from her with his partner, and his partner says, oh, this guy, he just hates on everything. He just loves to hate. Even when he doesn't even, so his thing was, he just writes bad reviews. And when I heard that and I went and dug deeper, he lost his job at all these magazines. All he would do, he spoke badly about Amy Winehouse's first album. But because I was already kind of insecure, I was competing with Abel and I was watching all that. I allowed someone's no and I was like, nah, like that was once that happened. It was like, nah, yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Curtis?
Hi, I do. Hi, Curtis. I'm Leanne. I
Hi,
grew up.
Leanne.
Oh, hi. Hi. I grew up at 1008 Moyer Drive in Sherwood Park.
That sounds super familiar.
Yeah. Also came home from raves at 5 a.m. Anyway, I've been following where you've gone since, I don't know, I know we met through Megan Mueller, like Megan Rose Mueller, probably really briefly, but yeah, thank you. This is wonderful. I'm trying to take more risks. And thank you. What a nice seminar.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't know how it would go. I'm just like, and yeah, hopefully, yeah. Thank you for saying that. And the risks, yes, it's a mantra. I've been telling myself now, because the thing is, we then tend to, as we move along in our career, we start to then think that, oh, this is really important. This is a really important show. This is a really important opportunity. And we put this pressure and we stop taking the risks. But the risks are what got us there. And it's only by like being willing to destroy the thing sometimes that we then make art and we make something that really has an impact or a vibration. At least that's now my belief. But it's scary. Yeah.
Hi. Hi, thank you for your talk, Curtis. I'm Carly.
Hi, Carly.
You had mentioned sort of wanting to elaborate on the importance of intuition as you're making work. And I'm just wondering, like, when you're talking about sort of intuition and then like moving across all these different mediums, can you just talk about like how that unfolds for you and like where you get stuck or where you kind of have to navigate that like materially or whatever? I just want to hear more about working across different
So what music taught me, it was like, so when our band would record an album, no one was a mixer or a masterer, so we would have to find those people. So that is what I've done to move through mediums. When I wanted to build that temple, I started being like, I need to find stonemasons, and I need to find stonemasons that will get what I'm doing. And so by get what I'm doing, I found these guys who started a company because they were tired of working with old guys who are racist and misogynists. And it was just like, oh, okay, so I find people who are willing to help me see through the idea, but can provide a whole lot of skills that I don't have to be able to, okay, well, I'm going to try beading now. Well, these guys I sat down to learn how to bead with, they were masters, you know? Yeah. And also acknowledging that I'm going to suck in the beginning. It's going to suck, and that might be the best objects that I make.
That's really good to hear. Okay, thank you.
I think we're gonna have to jump over to the other link.
Okay.
Curtis, thank you so much. That was amazing. Yeah, and what a storyteller.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you.